Okay, Clint, congratulations on Lawyer of the Year for 2018. This is for posterity, so tell us a little bit about yourself. At the awards ceremony, they talked a little bit, your wife talked about your school background, and I understand, so you can skip the the garbage dump truck. But you may mention that you wanted to be a criminal defense lawyer very early.
I certainly wanted to be doing criminal work, whether it was prosecutor or defense attorney. I don't really recall, but really since the third grade, I grew up in New Jersey. A long way in coming to Dallas, but I do remember ever since about the third grade wanting to become a criminal defense lawyer. I toyed with maybe doing something in journalism, but other than that, it really never wavered.
Wow. What did you get your degree in?
Poli-sci major, so
okay.
Law school was the the next logical choice. So that was the plan all along.
And where'd you go?
I went to college at University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and then law school at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville.
Okay. And so how did you get from New Jersey to Dallas?
Well, that is a story because I grew up on the East Coast. I was actually born in Brooklyn, but my family moved to New Jersey fairly soon after, a suburb of New York. We lived about 45 minutes from New York City. And went to college in Pennsylvania, law school, Virginia, as far south as I had ever been. And went to work for a civil law firm in D.C. for a couple of years after law school, and hated every day but payday. Like payday, came once a month, but beyond that, I just hated it. And I ultimately sent out resumes to both prosecutors' offices and public defenders, either local where I was licensed or federal public defenders, really any city I could conceive myself living in. And got a few interviews on the East Coast. I was dating someone at the time on the West Coast, so did a fair amount of interviews. They didn't work out, and then got the offer in Dallas, and here I am. I was here maybe about 2-3 weeks, and somebody took me to Billy Bob's out in Fort Worth, and I said, before I got to Texas, I just pictured it as one big Billy Bob's. So, it took me a while to get my bearings.
So you were at the Federal Public Defender's Office in Dallas?
I would say from 92 to 97, yes.
Okay, 5 years now. And then private practice?
Private practice, I've been law partners. Somebody who left the Federal Public Defenders with me, Mick Mickelson, he left shortly thereafter. I took a sort of a sabbatical to go down to Costa Rica and try to learn Spanish. That didn't quite work out. But when I got back, he was ready to leave, and this December will be 20 years with the law partners.
Okay, great. Any major influences on you in terms of being a criminal defense lawyer? Any heroes or?
Well, there are certainly a lot of heroes for what I've seen people accomplish. And I mentioned you for one, David Bodsford, Shirley Bacchus LaBelle, a lot of the bigger names in Dallas. So I've been able to see them work, but it was really after I left private practice, after I left the Federal Public Defender's Office, we were fairly inoculated. There weren't, if I recall, I might have done 1 or 2 joint trials with Gary Udishin, impressed with Gary Udishin. So it was after I left it a chance to observe these people and see how they work. It was probably more the influence on me than anything else.
Okay. And let's talk about the biker case, which I think was the instigation for your
Right.
award. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I was, I had heard about it when it happened, but didn't pay much more attention other than the news something big with bikers happened down in Waco. And it might have been 2 or 3 days later, and I got a call. I'm trying to remember the relationship now. It is my wife has an aunt. That aunt was taking care of her son's child, but the child was also the daughter of, was a daughter of, and then my client happened to be the stepfather who married so it was very convoluted. But anyway, I got the call from Matt Clenden's father, and he told me the story about, how his son was arrested. He was just at Twin Peaks that day, and he was, locked up on $1 million bond. And my first reaction was, this can't be right. This sounds like some sort of snafu. Just get a local lawyer, that's some juice down there, and get this taken care of, because it couldn't be right. And so we left it at that. And then he called me back maybe about 2 hours later and said, all the local lawyers were taken and they were charging exorbitant fees. And I said, well, as long as I'm coming from Dallas, I'm more than happy to do it. And then started getting into it and just realized what a debacle it was, and that's sort of the best word for a debacle.
And tell us about some of your victories in the course of that case. I know a couple of them, but I don't think I know them all.
Well, it's funny because I really think that the major thing I accomplished is sort of changing the narrative. When this first happened, there were world reporters, certainly national reporters, but also world reporters, and it was reported as a biker gang shootout with more bikers coming to kill the police. And I sooner realized after talking to my client that most of these guys are sort of weekend warriors. My guy had 2 or 3 kids, wife, ran his own landscaping business, and I realized that I had never. This was the first case I really had much press coverage of, and the DA Rainey was out there giving his own press coverage about how they were going to show these people they couldn't come into Waco and mess with our city. And I realized you needed to put some faces. Matt Clendenin was a former firefighter, and so we had a press conference. It was me and 2 other lawyers we put together at Matt Clendenin's parents' house, and we got a good turnout, and we were able to start changing the narrative. So I think, and that was the goal all along, to change the narrative about this. But I also think along the way, we had a lot of little legal maneuvering. I was gagged fairly early on in the case. There was a gag order, and the next day, in fact, I told the judge, I said, here's a case, you're going to be reversed, and he basically said the Court of Appeals is upstairs. And I said, sure you don't want to read the case? He goes, I'll read it, but I'm not changing my mind. Next day, I had a 35-page mandamus filed. The Court of Appeals, the Waco Court of Appeals, asked for a response, and which they're required to do if they're going to grant the mandamus. And I would say 2-3 weeks later, they granted the mandamus, told the judge he had to rescind the gag order. And then, to my surprise, actually, because I thought the law was pretty clear, the state asked the Court of Criminal Appeals to stay the case. The Court of Criminal Appeals stayed the case, and maybe a year later, they dissolved the stay without any opinion, and basically the mandamus took effect. But periodically, it was funny because I'd go back to law school. I filed 2 briefs in the Court of Appeals about clean hands, because you can't go in and say you want a gag order when you're out there, the DA violating the gag order, you don't have clean hands. So it was sort of an interesting. I hadn't heard the term clean hands in a legal sense since law school. So the gag order was one. Judge Strother, who was one of the district judges down there, we had him disqualified for the appearance of bias. And it was funny because the visiting judge that came in to hear the case, he told me, I came in, didn't think there was any chance in hell I was going to grant it. But the more you persuaded me that it wasn't so much, and I said this to him, I don't know Judge Strother from Adam. He may be a great guy, but it's just the appearance, and that's what you have to, how is the man on the street, given what he's done so far. There was a police detective who was appointed head of Foreman of the grand jury, and that was one of the, ultimately didn't happen, but that was a potential grand jury that was going to hear the Twin Peaks cases. He set the case, 177 people indicted. Judge Strother set the case that the state wanted to go on first, even though me and a few other lawyers were asking for speedy trial for our clients. So it was more, is the person on the street, how are they going to react to this? And I think ultimately, as I said, the judge changed his mind. So Judge Strother was recused. We had moved to disqualify the district attorney's office, and we had a fairly long hearing. It turned out, ultimately, that the police chief was on vacation the day of the incident. He was back on the East Coast someplace. And so there were 3 assistant police chiefs, but one was the acting police chief. And when we started to have this hearing, it became obvious fairly quickly that the police were not in favor of arresting everybody that day. They told a insisting and insisting, and ultimately said, well, I'm going to call the police chief I think he was in Baltimore or Boston or someplace on the East Coast, and I'm going to get him to sign off on this. And the police chief actually ultimately did sign off on it, but as part of the disqualification hearing, I asked the police chief, did you know whether you were approving an arrest for jaywalking or capital murder or anything in between? And he said no. I just told him, if he thought we could arrest people, we could arrest people. So it was really clear that Abel Reyna was driving this show. And so, ultimately that led to the disqualification hearing. We moved to disqualify him, and if he's as a potential witness, because in most cases you're going to ask the police officer, why did this happen? Why did you do this? Why did we make this decision? Well, in this case, the police weren't making the decision. Abel Reyna was making the decision. Ultimately lost that in front of Judge Johnson, and I'll kind of circle back to that, and took a mandamus on that, had oral argument and lost the mandamus. But in the interim, we learned that Judge Johnson was Abel Reyna's former law partner. And I was not totally familiar with all the recusal bases because they're in the civil code, but the fact that Reyna was going to be a material witness, whether he was disqualified or not, meant Johnson shouldn't have sat on the disqualification, and so Johnson ultimately gets disqualified. Then we get closer and closer to the Clendenin trial, and the Carousel trial is going on at the same time. And the 3 or 4 DAs that are working on the Clendenin trial also working on the Carousel trial. And they were having, Casey was giving them fits of, breaks because there was no discovery, so they have to take, afternoons off while discovery was gathered. And so the trial was taking a lot longer than they thought it would. And at one point we had the conference on the Clendenin case with the visiting judge, Judge Shaver, and they asked to postpone the trial because they were in the Clendenin trial. And Judge Shaver said, well, that's not my problem. How many people work in your office? And so with that, and the idea that I was going to call Reyna as a witness, they eventually did voluntarily disqualify themselves, even though I lost the motion, and we got special prosecutors, attorneys out of, criminal defense attorneys now out of Houston who were former prosecutors in Harris County. And I think,
Who were they?
I'm trying to remember. Brian Roberts was the main one. Mandy Moore was involved. Brian Benke, I believe his name is, and I forget the fourth one. But and I reached out to them in the very beginning, and I said, what did you do to piss God off that you wound up having to get stuck with this? And I said, well, Judge Shaver asked, and when Judge Shaver calls, you don't say no. And we worked well together. I sat down and I told him, you're going to go through all this stuff, and here's the couple of bad things about my client, but you're going to see he wasn't involved. And they didn't know me from Adam, so I don't know how much credibility they gave me, but ultimately, it took 6-9 months, but ultimately they came to that conclusion and dismissed the case and said there wasn't even probable cause to have indicted this case in the first place. So they did the exact right thing. And at that point, Reyna had started dismissing cases, but he would dismiss cases with language without prejudice, saying, we're only going to dismiss in order to conserve our office's resources. So there was a lot of weasel language in those cases that was not in the Clendenin dismissal.
Okay.
Meanwhile, I had another client, George Bergman, and right before trial, the first assistant called, right before his trial, the first assistant called me up and said, is he willing to take anything? I said, well, talk to him. At that point, I think they'd offered some felony 2 years, and it might have went down to probation at some point. But anyway, so that was the initial discussion. And he said no, and so we're getting closer to trial, and I meet with the DA again, and he said, well, will he take a misdemeanor? And I called him up and I said, sure you don't want to take him, because he had already told me he wouldn't, but when the offer's on the table, you're looking at 25 to life, sometimes your perspective changes. But to his credit, he said, no, I don't want to take a misdemeanor. And ultimately, the agreement I reached with the prosecutor, the first assistant there, because they were not disqualified from the Bergman case. So on the Bergman case, we agreed that there would be a dismissal, but we would continue the trial until after the election. Now, that wasn't the public announcement, but that essentially what it was, that they did not want to start dismissing cases before the election. And that's how we resolved the primary election, and that's how we resolved the Broden case.
Okay. I think I can see that. You told the stories at the awards banquet, but tell the story, the funny stories, the strange things that happened in this case.
Well, my favorite, and it was early on in the case, there was a JP, and he set all these $1 million bonds. He was a former state trooper. There was some machinations to get him in office. I mean, that was a local political thing, so I didn't really know about it, but wasn't a lawyer. Set $1 million bonds for everybody, you know, told the newspaper he was doing it to send a message, which, you know, obviously is not the purpose of bond, to send messages, but that's what he told the paper, the reason he said identical bonds, identical probable cause affidavits. And so one of the first things I wanted to do was to get the videos of the scene. There were video at Twin Peaks, and ultimately I got that, which resulted in the gag order, but I also wanted to get the Don Carlos video, which was the restaurant next door that, you know, shared a parking lot with Twin Peaks. And so I went down to the JP's office, expecting really just deal with the clerk, but the JP came out, and I'd said some not nice things about him, but he was friendly enough, and he said, you know, what can I do for you? And I said, well, I'm here, I want to do an application for the Don Carlos subpoena. And he said, well, how are you going to subpoena Don Carlos? And at that point, it didn't really click to me that he wasn't firing on all cylinders, but I said, well, I'm just going to do a subpoena for the custodian. He looked at me, and I'll never forget, he said, the custodian? As if he thought, you know, I was going to get the guy who mopped the floors. And then I said, well, the custodian, the records. And then I don't know that he got it, but he pretended to get it at that point. So that was one of the more amusing things. And then I would get a lot of phone calls because my client was in the press down there, and this was early on in the case, so it was a pretty live story. And so people would come out of the woodwork. And one day I got a voicemail message when I got back to the office. It was an old grizzly guy, and one of the judges down there was Judge Johnson. And he said, Mr. Broden, I need to tell you something. Matt Johnson was a kid on my block when he was growing up, and I want you to know he was a pussy then, and he's a pussy now, and if you need me to testify to that, just call me. And they left the numbers. So, but it was, I'd get calls, not humorous calls, but I'd get calls, and it was a lot of elderly people, honestly, that would call and just say, we appreciate what you're doing, and I'd get some letters. Almost felt like a sports player. I'd get some fan mail, not as much as Derek Jeter, perhaps, but I'd get some fan mail, so that was pleasant. So there were some humorous times, and I mean, you really had to find the humor in it all, because it was just such a bad situation what they were doing down there, and it was sort of like, it was the first time I actually put a cartoon in a motion, when they appointed the foreperson of the grand jury that I thought was potentially going to hear the Twin Peaks cases, I put a old Far Side cartoon actually into the motion because I wanted to disqualify him as the foreman, where there is a cat on trial and there are 12 dogs sitting in the jury box. Right. And then I put, I forget whether I embedded a clip or just made reference to it, an old I Love Lucy episode where Lucy's arrested by the police officer for speeding and then says, well, I want to fight this, and goes to the town hall, and the police officer takes off his policeman's hat and puts on his robe and says, I'll listen to your case. And that's sort of what, it was live practice in there. And the funny thing is people warned me, the Waco people warned me, they said, this is like falling through the looking glass. And I've always heard those stories. I don't go into small towns a lot, but anytime I do, I've heard those stories, and normally, as long as you don't act like a jerk, some big city slicker lawyer, normally it's not nearly as bad as they tell you it is. If you're polite and you slow yourself down a little bit. I can't say that about Waco. Waco was everything I was promised and more. It's just that, I don't know whether it's the Baylor influence or what, but it is a different world down there.
Are there any other cases that are memorable for you that we don't know about?
One of the cases I'm actually most proud of is a pro bono case. Somebody was actually on 2020 or Dateline in one of those cases, but one of those TV shows once, and somebody called me up, and it was a guy who, I believe believe he was about 14 and his brother was 16, and they were accused of sexually molesting their cousin. And the older brother pled guilty, and the younger brother, who I would ultimately come to represent, went to trial and was convicted in a, I guess convicted isn't the right word, but it was juvenile court, but got a determined sentence. And they had held the lawyers, and they appealed, and what have you. And ultimately, the girl recanted, and it turned out it was a product of the girl's mother trying to divorce the father, who was the uncle to the kids, and she had accused the previous husband of abusing a kid, so she really couldn't accuse that husband, so she reached out to the next best thing, and then kidnapped the kids to Florida. But I spent a lot of time on that case. We filed a writ of habeas corpus, which we lost basically on 2 grounds. One is the actual innocence, and then they were convicted, and the state's expert, Dr. Willoughby, talked about, now I'm trying to remember the name of the exam where you look at pictures and see, but not the plethysmograph, but another sort of an able assessment. Okay. And so we lost both because we wanted him out, but we also wanted him found actually innocent. We lost there. We lost in the Court of Appeals, and then it was the first. And then I said, well, I've got to just go to the Texas Supreme Court rather than the Court of Criminal Appeals. So I wanted to get some people with some juice on the case, and former Supreme Court Justice Phillips got on the case, and the former clerk at the court. And the court reversed 9-0 on the punishment issue. Unfortunately, we didn't win on the actual innocence, but he was a situation where he was not going to get parole because he wouldn't admit he did it. And within a few days, he was walking out of court. In connection with that, we actually brought a defamation suit against the person who filed the mother of the girl, and tried that case in federal court. We went up to Iowa. Only time in Iowa, Muscatine, Iowa. I stopped to see the Field of Dreams and the Herbert Hoover Presidential Museum when I was up there. And according to that, Calvin Coolidge is to blame for the Depression, not Herbert Hoover. But anyway, we went up to Muscatine, got her served, and we had a 2 or 3 day trial where she talked about kidnapping the kids, and I said, well, why did you take the kids to Florida without telling anybody? Well, the kids wanted to see the dolphins. That was her explanation. So that became the theme of the trial, because the kids never got to see the dolphins in Florida, needless to say. And it turned out, and this is where we got a lot of this information, she had made other false allegations. And ultimately, come closing argument, the lawyer for the mother made a directed verdict that the judge granted, basically saying, well, this guy's, at this point, it's still in jail, so we really can't say that she defamed him if he's in jail. But we talked to the jury afterwards, and they were talking about awarding millions of dollars. We never would have seen that. It was more a discovery tool. We were able to, that it was really to take her deposition, and once we took her deposition, I said, screw it, we might as well just try it. So it was 2 or 3 days in Waco, which is, I think, the only time I'd been to Waco before the biker thing, but it was in front of Judge Smith in Waco, so we tried that. So, that was this whole process, up to the Supreme Court and back. That was a 3 or 4 year process, and that was all pro bono. So that's a particular case I'm proud of.
You've been on the board. How long have you been in TCDLA and been on the board?
Well, I joined TCDLA when Mick and I went into private practice. I was not, as a federal public defender, I didn't really see at the time the value of TCDLA. I was a member of NACDL, where I'm a lifetime member, but so as soon as we went into private practice, we joined TCDLA. I joined the board. Last year I went off the board, so I think I had 2 terms on the board, so up until last year I was on the board for 6 years.
I didn't know that. I didn't know you went off.
Yeah, no, my time came up. I mean, I will probably reapply.
Okay.
Because I enjoyed it. I enjoy the camaraderie more probably than the seeing how the sausage is made, so to speak.
Right, it's the fellowship.
You know, I think you get a lot out of having dinner with people and bouncing ideas off of people and hearing about their cases, and, you know, they'll say something and you'll say, well, that's very similar to an issue I have in my case, and you get the research, and, you know, it works both ways, but I think that is probably what I get the most value, or got the most value for being on board.
Anything I left out that you wanted to say that I didn't have?
No, you know, I said it at the luncheon, but, you know, to see the names of the people that received this award over the years, you know, I went on the website when I was told I was going to share the award with Casey, and just to be among those people, yourself included twice, I believe. It really, you know, when you're starting out, you never think you're going to see your name on a list like that, and so it is truly humbling.
Well, welcome aboard, man.
I appreciate joining the club.